Let's jump right in. The night shift isn't just about, fighting off yawns and chugging way too much coffee. For the folks actually tasked with keeping the lights on while the rest of the world shuts down, it's a journey into this profound and honestly often terrifying isolation. In this explainer, we're diving into the deeply unsettling reality of the graveyard shift. We've got 5 verified accounts here, and we're going to see exactly what happens when that extreme isolation is broken by things that, well, should be impossible. There's this quote: "The first night you work a graveyard shift, something changes in you that never quite changes back." And man, that really hits the nail on the head. It's this bone-deep realization that the world you thought you understood, it has a second version of itself. One that literally only comes out when everyone else is fast asleep. The workers whose stories we're exploring today, they had absolutely no reason to lie, and frankly, every reason to wish they'd never been there in the first place. All right, moving on to Section 1, the world at 3 a.m., the psychological shift. So, an 11-year veteran overnight nurse describes the hospital at 3 a.m. as essentially a completely different building. Think about it during the day. It's chaotic, it's bright, it's bustling with visitors and staff, the whole shebang. But at night, the lights are dimmed right down, the hallways, they actually seem to stretch out and get physically longer. All that kinetic energy of the daytime is just completely drained away. And what you're left with is this eerie, liminal space that fundamentally messes with human perception. When you're isolated in that kind of environment, your brain does this thing where it learns to filter out all the beeping monitors, the distant rolling carts, the soft rhythmic exhale of ventilators, and it turns it all into a predictable baseline of white noise. And this actually ties perfectly into real-world sleep deprivation studies. Those studies show that when the brain gets starved of varying stimulation, it experiences something called apophenia. Basically, it gets desperate and starts searching for patterns in the static, sometimes even creating its own. And that is exactly what makes actual anomalies so absolutely terrifying. When something genuinely doesn't belong in that soundscape, you hear it immediately because there's zero daytime chatter to drown it out. That brings us to Section 2, sensory intruders, breaking the isolation. Let's look at the routine of a security guard at a massive Midwestern shopping mall. 4 years, 0 incidents. He knew exactly how that building sounded. I mean, he knew which specific doors rattled in the wind, which air vents hummed, which floorboards creaked under his boots. That extreme, rigid familiarity is absolutely crucial to understand here, because it's exactly why a noise he heard at the East Anchor store right at 2 a.m. was just so incredibly jarring. So on this completely quiet October night, he hears footsteps inside that locked Anchor store. Now, he held the only key. Security cameras show the gate was locked down tight and the interior lights were completely off. Dispatch tells him to do a visual sweep, so he unlocks the gate and heads in with his flashlight. He sweeps the aisles, the back stockroom, the fitting rooms. Nothing. He's literally almost back to the front gate when he hears it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps directly above him. And here's the massive problem with that. There was no second floor. There wasn't even a crawl space. It was just a flat roof. Now, management tried to brush it off, telling him it was just a raccoon or a bird. But remember, he knew the building's acoustics intimately. He noted that these steps landed exactly like someone trying very, very hard not to be heard. He stood there, completely frozen in the dark for 2 straight minutes, just listening as the footsteps moved the entire length of the store and then just stopped. Yeah, he never went back in there without backup. We actually see a really similar auditory anomaly with an Ohio factory worker. Now, we know sleep deprivation frequently causes auditory hallucinations. Actually, a super common one is hearing your own name called out in a quiet room. But here's the thing. At 4 a.m., completely alone on his massive section of the factory floor, this worker heard his name spoken clearly right behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Then, 30 seconds later, he heard it again, but closer. Now, if this was just sleep deprivation playing tricks on him, the story would end right there. But 3 days later, a coworker from a completely different section of the factory casually brings up hearing a strange voice at 4 a.m. She said it spoke a name she didn't even know, twice, echoing right across the empty concrete floor. You guessed it, it was his name. That right there is the true psychological weight of the graveyard shift. It's that horrifying moment of discovering your mind isn't actually playing tricks on you at all. Let's dive deeper in Section 3, Unexplained Absences, the gaps in time. 18 minutes.
Now, sleep studies tell us that exhausted night shift workers often experience what's called microsleeps. These are really brief, unlogged gaps in time where your brain literally just shuts down for a second. But guys, this was not a microsleep. This was the exact physical gap of time between 1 and 2 a.m. when Curtis, a food plant worker down in rural Georgia, would just vanish. Every single shift. We're talking about a massive building the size of 2 football fields, manned by only 7 people, and an incredibly observant overnight quality control worker started noticing his precise, predictable disappearance. So when she finally asked a veteran coworker about it, she got a really chilling warning. She was told, do not follow him. Turns out the last 2 people who tried following Curtis had disappeared without a trace. They just abruptly quit their jobs and moved away without telling a single soul. So, understandably, she kept her distance. But one night, passing by the locker room during that exact 18-minute window, she heard him. He was reading aloud in this steady, rhythmic cadence. The language, she realized she wasn't recognizing a single word he was saying. She transferred to the day shift pretty much immediately after that.
But it's not just physical absences. Then there are the absences of the mind. An ER nurse encountered a man who was found just collapsed out on a highway. He was brought in right after midnight. He was completely uninjured physically, had absolutely zero ID on him, and he refused to speak a single word. He just laid there staring blankly up at the ceiling for a solid hour, just projecting this total, unnerving emptiness out into a totally quiet Pacific Northwest hospital.
Finally, after an hour of just dead silence, he spoke. He looked directly at the nurse and asked her a question that would honestly terrify anyone working the night shift. He asked if she had ever seen what was in the room with her right now. When she nervously assured him that, the room was empty, he just gave this slow nod and replied that he thought that, too, the first time.
Naturally, the nurse was thoroughly unsettled and immediately moved him to a different room, right up close to the nurse's station. But at shift handover, he was gone. The heavy window in his room was locked from the inside. When they checked the security footage, it revealed that between 5:47 and 5:49 a.m., the one single camera in that specific hallway mysteriously lost its feed. By 5:50, the guy had completely vanished into thin air, and not a single staff member saw him leave. It was quite literally a gap in space and time.
Okay, moving to Section 4, the unseen watcher, the climax. Let's head to a pediatric oncology hospital. A night nurse suddenly noticed that a 6-year-old child was missing from her bed in room 7. The craziest part, the heart monitors hadn't sounded an alarm because they hadn't been ripped off in a panic. No, they had been carefully, deliberately unclipped and just set gently on the pillow. The nurse is frantically searching, right? She finally finds the child, a little girl who couldn't even walk without assistance, mind you, standing all the way at the very end of the hallway window. She was just standing there, waving happily out at a totally empty parking lot. The little girl claims she was waving at a man who visited her every single night. Obviously, security pulled the exterior camera footage, and they actually found him. Every single night, for 9 consecutive nights, a man in a heavy dark coat would arrive from the street at exactly 2:40 a.m. He would walk up, stand in the exact spot the little girl had pointed to, and just stare unblinking up at the window of room 7. He'd stand there until exactly 3:15 a.m., and then just turn and walk away. For that entire window of time, he never moved from his spot, and he never, ever looked at any other window in the building. As soon as security discovered this and started looking for him, this unknown watcher just vanished. He never appeared on the hospital's footage again. But honestly, the strangest part? Months later, when the nurse gently asked the now-recovered child about her late-night visitor, the little girl had absolutely zero memory of the man. She didn't even remember waving at the window. It was almost as if the night shift had just swallowed the memory whole. And finally, Section 5, Conclusion, when the dark notices you. Look, while most nights on the graveyard shift are really just quiet, exhausting battles against sleep deprivation, occasionally someone or something is actually paying attention. The people working these jobs, they're the only ones left standing watch while the rest of the entire world powers down. And sometimes, in that extremely vulnerable state, they find themselves coming face to face with the things that operate out in the margins, the things slipping through locked mall doors, speaking from empty factory floors, and standing completely silently in hospital parking lots. As the quote says, things that learned a long time ago that the dark is when no one is paying attention. So the next time you find yourself suddenly awake at 4 a.m., I want you to consider this. Science tells us that in the dark, a highly sleep-deprived brain will eagerly invent ghosts just to fill the silence. But the truly terrifying part isn't what your own isolated mind might invent. No, it's the very real possibility that while you were lying there totally assuming you were completely alone, something, somewhere, was actually looking back at you. Did anything notice you were there? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, sleep well.